The silent sands of the Egyptian desert, like a shroud of eternity, conceal beneath their golden mantle countless secrets of bygone eras. They are the keepers of stories, buried under the weight of millennia, witnesses to the rise and fall of great civilizations, the birth and death of gods and pharaohs. And among these stories, there is one enveloped in a special haze of mystery, intrigue, and almost mystical oblivion. A story about a pharaoh who dared to challenge a 1,000-year-old order, about a ruler whose name was cursed and scraped from monuments, whose cities were abandoned and destroyed, and whose very memory was meant to dissolve into nothingness, like a mirage under the scorching sun. Imagine the 13th year of the reign of the mighty Pharaoh Ramesses II. Mighty builders and stonemasons, carrying out their master's will, meticulously erased the cartouches bearing the name of the hated predecessor. Hammers fall upon exquisite reliefs, statues are shattered, and the names of Akhenaten and his beautiful wife Nefertiti are anathematized. Their city, Akhetaten, the horizon of Aten, once shining like a jewel in the desert, stands abandoned, its palaces and temples gradually turning into ruins, becoming a haven for jackals and scorpions. The ancient priests nod in satisfaction. Justice is restored. Heresy is eradicated. Egypt returns to its ancestral gods. It seemed the apostate pharaoh had vanished forever into oblivion, his revolution stifled, and his name would be known only to a narrow circle of initiates as a warning about the perils of pride and deviation from tradition. But the sands, so diligently preserving oblivion, also possess another, astonishing ability. Sooner or later, they return what is hidden. More than 3,000 years later, when the world had long forgotten the sun-worshipping pharaoh, when the names of Amun-Ra, Osiris, and Isis had become the domain of historians and mythologists, an archaeologist's pickaxe, plunging into the dry earth near the modern site of Tel el-Amarna, began to awaken the ghosts of the past. From beneath centuries-old layers of dust and sand, fragments of unprecedented beauty, pieces of unique art, and tablets with enigmatic writings began to emerge. And gradually, step by step, before an astonished humanity, the figure of one of the most enigmatic and controversial rulers in world history began to take shape. Amenhotep IV, who adopted the name Akhenaten. This story is about him, about the pharaoh who attempted to change the world, thousands of years ahead of his time, about his great love and great faith, about his grandiose vision and tragic fall. This is a journey into the very heart of ancient Egypt, into the era of splendor and intrigue of the 18th dynasty, into a time when a drama unfolded on the banks of the Nile, the echoes of which are heard to this day. We will walk the streets of his lost city, try to understand the motives behind his actions, and look into the faces of his contemporaries, loyal companions and sworn enemies. We will touch upon the mysteries of the el-Amarna period, attempt to unravel the enigma of Nefertiti's disappearance, and the reasons for Akhenaten's fierce posthumous persecution. Prepare for a long and fascinating immersion into the world of the reformer pharaoh, whose life and reign still provoke heated debate and continue to stir the minds of researchers and all who are interested in the great mysteries of history. This story, like an ancient papyrus, will unfold before you, slowly revealing ever new details, compelling you to reflect on the eternal questions of faith, power, love, and the price one must pay for attempting to change the world. Before the shadow of the future reformer, Akhenaten, touches the ancient temples of Thebes, let us transport ourselves back several decades to an era rightly called the Golden Age of Egyptian civilization. The air is suffused with the scents of incense and blooming lotus. The waters of the Nile carry abundance, and Egypt's treasury overflows with Nubian gold and tribute from conquered peoples. On the throne of the two lands sits Pharaoh Amenhotep III, nicknamed the Magnificent. His reign is the apogee of the power and prosperity of the 18th dynasty. But beneath this dazzling gilding, the seeds of future upheavals are already ripening, and in the shadow of Karnak's majestic pylons, a force is maturing that will soon challenge the pharaoh himself. Amenhotep III, the ninth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, inherited from his ancestors, the Thutmosids, a vast empire stretching from the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south to the banks of the Euphrates in the north. It was a time of relative peace when Egypt's formidable war chariots inspired awe in its neighbors, and diplomacy and dynastic marriages cemented international alliances. The pharaoh, whose name meant Amun is satisfied, was not a great conqueror like Thutmose III, but he was a skilled ruler, a patron of the arts, and a builder. His reign, lasting nearly 4 decades, from approximately 1391 to 1353 BCE, was marked by unprecedented construction. Grandiose temples, palaces, and statues were erected throughout Egypt. The Luxor Temple, expanded and adorned by Amenhotep III, still astounds with its majesty. His mortuary temple at el-Amarna was one of ancient Egypt's largest cult structures, from which, alas, only the famous Colossi of Memnon have survived, 2 gigantic statues of the pharaoh himself that once guarded the entrance to this grand complex. Life at the court of Amenhotep III was the epitome of luxury and sophistication. The pharaoh surrounded himself with brilliant dignitaries, talented architects, sculptors, and scribes. The art of this period reached its highest level, distinguished by elegance of form, attention to detail, and fine workmanship. Depictions of Amenhotep III himself emphasized his divine status, his connection with the sun, god Ra. He was proclaimed the dazzling sun disk of all lands, and his Hebsed Jubilee festivals, celebrated with unprecedented pomp, were intended to confirm his eternal youth and divine power. But Amenhotep III was not famed only for construction and feasts. He was also a skilled diplomat. The Amarna archive, found much later, preserved for us his correspondence with the rulers of Babylonia, Mitanni, Assyria, and the Hittite kingdom. These clay tablets, written in Akkadian cuneiform, the international language of the time, reveal a complex web of dynastic marriages, gift exchanges, which were often disguised tribute or trade, political intrigue Japan, and requests for gold, of which Egypt, according to one correspondent, had as much as sand. Amenhotep III skillfully maintained the balance of power in the Near East, ensuring Egypt's dominant position. However, behind this facade of splendor and power, certain problems were hidden. The enormous wealth flowing into Egypt was concentrated not only in the hands of the pharaoh and his court, but also in the temples, especially the temple of Amun-Ra in Thebes. The priesthood of Amun, the chief god of the empire, was becoming an increasingly influential and wealthy corporation, essentially a state within a state. Their lands were exempt from taxes, and their treasury was replenished by generous gifts from pharaohs and nobles. The high priest of Amun held one of the highest positions in the state. His power and authority were immense. This growing power of the priesthood could not but cause concern for pharaohs striving for absolute power. Perhaps Amenhotep III himself began to feel this pressure and take some steps to counterbalance Amun's influence. For example, by paying more attention to other cults, including the solar cult of Ra-Harakti. It was in this atmosphere of magnificence, power, but also underlying tension between the pharaoh and the priesthood that he who would overturn all the foundations of ancient Egypt was destined to be born. And if Amenhotep III was the sun illuminating Egypt with its brilliance, then beside him shone the moon, no less bright and influential, his chief wife, the great royal wife, Tiye. Her story deserves separate, most careful attention, for she was not merely the pharaoh's consort, but an outstanding personality who played a colossal role in the political and religious life of Egypt. And, especially important for our narrative, the mother of the future, Akhenaten. Who was this woman, whose origins still cause debate, and whose influence on her son perhaps predetermined the course of Egyptian history. Tiye was not of royal blood by birth. Her parents, Yuya and Thuya, were prominent nobles from the city of Akhmim in Upper Egypt. Yuya held important posts such as Master of the Horse and Priest of Min. Thuya bore the title Ornament of the King and participated in the cult of the goddess Hathor. Their tomb, found almost intact in the Valley of the Kings, known as KV 46, became a sensation as the preservation of the mummies and funerary equipment was exceptional. The fact that non-royal individuals were accorded such an honor speaks to their high position at court. However, Amenhotep III's marriage to Tiye, daughter of provincial aristocrats, was somewhat unusual for pharaohs, who more often chose daughters of other pharaohs or foreign princesses as their chief wives to strengthen dynastic ties. This marriage, which took place at the very beginning of Amenhotep III's reign, indicates either the young pharaoh's great love or a shrewd political calculation aimed at strengthening ties with influential provincial nobility. Whatever the case, Tiye quickly rose to an exceptionally high position. She was not just the chief wife, but also the closest advisor, confidant, and effectively co-ruler with her husband. Her name was inscribed in cartouches alongside Amenhotep III's. Her images often accompanied those of the pharaoh, and sometimes she was depicted as being of the same height as him, emphasizing her equal status. In Tiye's honor, Amenhotep III even ordered a huge artificial lake to be dug in her hometown of Jaruka, modern Malkata, an unprecedented act for a queen. Tiye actively participated in state affairs. She corresponded with foreign rulers, as confirmed by the el-Amarna letters. For example, King Tushratta of Mitanni addressed her directly, asking her to influence Amenhotep III. This testifies to her political weight and authority on the international stage. She also played an important role in religious life, participating in ceremonies and rituals. There are suggestions that Tiye might have been associated with the cult of Aten even before it became the central deity under her son. Some researchers see in her Nubian roots, which might be indicated by the anthropological features of her mummy and those of her parents, a possible reason for her adherence to solar cults, which were strong in Nubia. But her main role for our story is that of a mother. Tiye bore Amenhotep III several children, including 2 sons. The elder son, Thutmose, was the heir to the throne, but died young during his father's lifetime. Thus, the next in line for succession was the younger son, Amenhotep, the future Akhenaten. What influence did this strong, intelligent, and powerful woman have on her son? We can confidently assume it was immense. She saw her husband, Amenhotep III, increasingly deify himself in his later years, proclaiming himself the living embodiment of the solar disk. She witnessed the growing power of Amun's priesthood, and perhaps shared concerns about their excessive influence. Surviving depictions of Tiye show her as a woman of strong character with an intelligent and perceptive gaze. She outlived her husband and continued to play an important role at the court of her son, Amenhotep IV, who would later become Akhenaten in the early years of his reign. Her wisdom and experience were undoubtedly sought by the young pharaoh embarking on radical reforms. Some historians even suggest that Tiye might have been one of the ideological inspirers, or at least a supporter of Akhenaten's early steps to elevate Aten. She died around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign and was buried with great honors, initially perhaps in Akhetaten, and then her mummy was moved to the Valley of the Kings. The personality of Queen Tiye is a key to understanding many events of the el-Amarna period. She was a bridge between the golden age of her husband and the revolutionary era of her son. She embodied the strength of the Egyptian woman, capable of influencing the destinies of the empire, and her upbringing, her views, her ambitions, undoubtedly left a deep mark on the soul of young Amenhotep, who was destined to write one of the most dramatic pages in the history of ancient Egypt. And so, in the shadow of the majestic pylons of Karnak Temple, in the very heart of Thebes, capital of a mighty empire. A boy is born into the royal family of Amenhotep III and Tiye. The exact date of his birth is unknown, but it occurred around the middle of his father's reign, approximately between 1370 and 1365 BCE. He is given the name Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, a name that, as the future would show, would become an ironic prologue to his destiny. No one then could have imagined that this infant, surrounded by luxury and adoration, would grow into a man who would declare war on Amun himself and his omnipotent priests. The childhood and youth of Prince Amenhotep are shrouded in mystery. Sources from that time are extremely scarce on details about the personal lives of royal children, unless they were direct heirs to the throne. Attention was focused on his elder brother, Crown Prince Thutmose, who was being prepared to become pharaoh. Thutmose held the title of High Priest of Ptah in Memphis, a traditional position for heirs. However, fate decreed otherwise. Prince Thutmose died young, and the eyes of the courtiers and all of Egypt turned to his younger brother. What was the upbringing of the future Akhenaten like? Undoubtedly, he received the best education available at the time. He studied literacy, sacred texts, mathematics, astronomy, and possibly foreign languages necessary for diplomacy. His tutors were the wisest scribes and priests. But besides the standard set of knowledge, what ideas shaped his worldview? We can only speculate. He grew up in an atmosphere where the cult of the sun played an increasingly prominent role. His father, Amenhotep III, as mentioned, actively promoted the idea of his divine connection with the sun, calling himself the dazzling Aten. The pharaoh's court was at Malkata, on the west bank of the Nile, opposite Thebes. It was a huge palace complex where solar symbolism was widely represented. Perhaps the young prince absorbed these ideas from childhood, observing the lavish rituals dedicated to the solar deity. The influence of his mother, Queen Tiye, also could not have failed to have an effect. Her strong character, her possible adherence to Heliopolitan theology, oriented towards the sun god Ra, could have sown the seeds of future religious upheaval in young Amenhotep's soul. Tiye was known for her intelligence and independent judgment, and she probably encouraged her son's inquisitiveness and desire for knowledge. Some researchers suggest that young Amenhotep may have had frail health, which distinguished him from the traditional image of the warrior pharaoh. His depictions in the el-Amarna style, with an elongated skull, thin neck, protruding belly, and feminine hips, have given rise to numerous medical hypotheses, from Marfan's syndrome to Froelich's syndrome. Although most of these hypotheses are now considered unlikely, and the specific style of depiction is attributed more to new artistic canons, it cannot be excluded that the prince was indeed inclined to contemplation and reflection rather than military exercises and hunting, which his ancestors so loved. This could have contributed to the development of a deep inner world and a penchant for philosophical inquiries. He witnessed the enormous influence of Amun's priests in Thebes. Karnak Temple, the main center of Amun's cult, was not just a religious institution, but a powerful economic and political force. Its riches were countless, its lands vast, and the high priest of Amun could rival the pharaoh himself in influence. Perhaps the young prince already perceived this as a threat to the unity of power and sought ways to weaken it. And so, around 1353 BCE, after a reign of nearly 40 years, Amenhotep III dies. Egypt plunges into mourning. The colossi of Memnon gaze silently at the rising sun, and young Amenhotep IV, who was probably between 15 and 20 years old at the time, prepares to ascend the throne of the two lands. The burden of governing a vast empire falls upon his shoulders. But in his soul, ideas are already maturing that are destined to shake Egypt to its very foundations. The beginning of his reign seems quite traditional. He is crowned in Thebes, assumes the pharaonic titulary, and performs the prescribed rituals in Amun's temple. But this is merely the calm before the storm. The seeds of revolution have already been sown, and soon they will sprout. The world does not yet know that the name Amenhotep, Amun is satisfied, will soon change to Akhenaten, beneficial to Aten, or effective spirit of Aten. And this change of name will become a symbol of the greatest religious upheaval in the history of ancient Egypt. When young Amenhotep IV ascended the throne of Egypt, few could have foreseen the scale of the coming changes. The early years of his reign seemed to follow the well-trodden path of his predecessors. He was crowned in Thebes, the center of the cult of Amun, the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon. He adopted the traditional royal titulary, which included Amun's name. He performed sacrifices in Karnak temple, demonstrating his adherence to the ancient gods. The priests of Amun probably breathed a sigh of relief, seeing that the new pharaoh, at least initially, did not intend to challenge their authority. But this was a deceptive calm. Beneath the surface of traditional rituals and official statements, the seeds of radical reform were already maturing. A reform that was to forever change Egypt's religious and political landscape. At the very beginning of his reign, Amenhotep IV married Nefertiti, whose name means "the beautiful one has come." Nefertiti's origin is still a subject of debate. According to one version, she was the daughter of the prominent dignitary Ai, who would later become Pharaoh himself. According to another, she might have been the Mitannian princess Tadukipa, sent to Amenhotep III's harem and inherited by his son. Whatever the case, Nefertiti was destined to become not just a queen, but an active participant and supporter of her husband's religious transformations. Her beauty, immortalized by the famous bust from Thutmose's workshop, became a symbol of the Amarna era. The first signs of impending change were subtle, almost imperceptible to the uninitiated. Amenhotep IV began to show a special interest in the cult of Aten, an ancient solar deity previously considered one of the aspects of the god Ra. Aten was depicted as a solar disk with rays ending in hands, which extended symbols of life, known as ankhs, to the pharaoh and his family. This was a more abstract and universal image of divinity than the anthropomorphic or zoomorphic gods of the traditional pantheon. As early as the second or third year of his reign, Amenhotep IV began construction of a large temple dedicated to Aten in the very heart of Karnak, near Amun's main sanctuary. This project was a daring challenge to Amun's priesthood. The Aten temple, named Gempaten, meaning Aten is found, differed from traditional Egyptian temples. It was built as an open court type, without a roof, so that Aten's sun rays could penetrate unhindered. The temple walls were adorned with colossal statues of the pharaoh in a new, unusual style that would later characterize el-Amarna art. These statues depicted Amenhotep IV with androgynous features, an elongated face, full lips, a slender waist, and wide hips. This style shocked contemporaries, accustomed to idealized and canonical depictions of pharaohs. Simultaneously, the pharaoh began to gradually elevate Aten above other gods. In his inscriptions, he increasingly mentioned Aten as the supreme deity, creator of all things. The pharaoh's titulary also began to change. He started calling himself High Priest of Ra-Harakti, rejoicing in the horizon, in his name as Shu, who is Aten. This was a complex theological construct, attempting to link Aten with the ancient sun god, Ra-Harakti, while emphasizing Aten's uniqueness and primacy. These first steps undoubtedly caused concern and dissatisfaction among Amun's priests and adherents of traditional cults. They saw the young pharaoh's actions as a threat to their position and age-old foundations. However, Amenhotep IV, relying on the support of his wife Nefertiti, his mother Tiye, who was still alive at this time, and a group of loyal dignitaries, continued on his chosen path. He had not yet completely broken with the cult of Amun and other gods, but the vector of his reforms was already clear. Tension was mounting. Conflict between the pharaoh and the priesthood was becoming inevitable, and this conflict was destined to be resolved in the most radical way: a complete break with the past and the creation of a new religion and a new capital. The golden age of Amenhotep III was replaced by an era of religious fanaticism and unprecedented change. Egypt stood on the brink of the Amarna revolution, and then the moment came when hidden tension erupted, when subtle hints gave way to open defiance. Amenhotep IV, the young pharaoh who had recently borne a name glorifying Amun, dared to take a step that shook the foundations of Egyptian civilization. He declared war on the 1,000-year-old pantheon of gods, at whose center stood the mighty Amun-Ra, and proclaimed Aten, the solar disk, giver of life to all that exists, as the sole, true God. This was not merely a religious reform, it was a revolution, comparable in its scale and consequences to the greatest spiritual upheavals in human history. But what was this new faith, and what forces drove the apostate pharaoh? Around the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV radically changed his name. Henceforth, he was not Amun is satisfied, but Akhenaten, beneficial to Aten, effective spirit of Aten, or useful for Aten. This change of name became a symbolic act of breaking with the past and proclaiming a new era. Simultaneously, the name of his chief wife also changed: Nefertiti. Beautiful are the perfections of Aten. The beautiful one has come. The royal couple henceforth positioned themselves as the sole intermediaries between Aten and humanity. The essence of the new religion, Atenism, lay in the worship of Aten as the sole, universal creator god. Aten was not an anthropomorphic deity with human passions and weaknesses, like most gods of the traditional pantheon. It was the life-giving power of the sun itself, its light and heat which permeates all creation, giving life to people, animals, and plants, both in Egypt and in foreign lands. In the famous Great Hymn to the Aten, authorship of which is attributed to Akhenaten himself, it is said, "You are one, but myriads of lives are in you, to animate them. Oh, how numerous are the things you have created, and those hidden from sight, O sole God, there is no other like you. You created the earth according to your desire, when you were alone. People, all cattle, large and small, all that is on earth, that walks on its feet, and that which is above, that flies on its wings." This was a concept strikingly close to monotheism, although debates about whether Atenism was true monotheism, or rather henotheism, that is, the worship of one god without denying the existence of others, or even monolatry, meaning the worship of one god as supreme while allowing for the existence of other, less significant ones, continue to this day. However, for its time, this was a radical departure from the polytheistic system, where every city, every region, every natural phenomenon had its patron gods. Akhenaten did not just elevate Aten, he began an active campaign against other gods, primarily against Amun-Ra, his main rival. The name of Amun and other major gods, such as Osiris, Isis, and Ptah, was systematically scraped from monuments, temples, tombs, and even personal belongings. The word gods in the plural was also subject to eradication. This was unprecedented iconoclasm, intended to erase the very memory of former beliefs. The temples of the old gods were closed, their priests were deprived of their positions and privileges, and their vast wealth was confiscated in favor of the crown and the new cult of Aten. This religious revolution also had profound political underpinnings. By elevating Aten, Akhenaten simultaneously strengthened his own power. He became not just pharaoh, but also the high priest, prophet, and sole son of the new god. Only through him and his family could Aten be approached. Thus, he eliminated the intermediaries in the form of the powerful priesthood of Amun, which effectively controlled vast resources and possessed significant political influence. The reform was aimed at centralizing power in the pharaoh's hands and creating a new ideological basis for his unlimited rule. The new religion also required new forms of worship. Instead of the dark, mysterious sanctuaries of traditional temples, where statues of gods were hidden in the depths and accessible only to a narrow circle of priests, Aten's temples were open spaces, flooded with sunlight. Rituals were performed in the open air, on altars laden with offerings, flowers, fruits, bread. Bloody sacrifices, characteristic of some old cults, were apparently abolished or minimized. The emphasis was on joyful praise of Aten, on gratitude for the life he bestowed. However, this revolution from above, imposed by the pharaoh's will, could not but meet resistance. For most Egyptians, accustomed to their traditional gods, to magic, amulets, and funerary cults, the new abstract religion was alien and incomprehensible. The rejection of Osiris, god of the underworld, and his cult questioned age-old beliefs about the afterlife and the rituals ensuring well-being in the hereafter. The closure of temples deprived people of their usual places of worship and festivals. Discontent grew not only among the priests who had lost their influence, but also among the broad strata of the population. Akhenaten, consumed by his idea, seemed oblivious to this growing unrest. He was convinced of his righteousness, of his mission to bring Egypt and the whole world the light of true faith, and to finally break with the past, to create an ideal world dedicated to Aten. He made another fateful decision: to leave Thebes, the stronghold of the old faith, and found a new capital, the city of the sun. In the heart of the desert, where the cliffs of the Nile's eastern bank form a natural semicircle, as if embracing the river, Akhenaten found a place for his dream. It was virgin land, undefiled by the worship of old gods, an ideal canvas for creating a city that was to become the center of a new world dedicated to Aten. And here, around the 6th year of his reign, the reformer pharaoh founded his new capital, Akhetaten, meaning horizon of Aten. This was not merely a transfer of the administrative center, it was an act of creation, an attempt to build a utopia on earth, a city of light, harmony, and worship of a single god. But what was this dream, and how much of it was realized? The choice of location for Akhetaten was not accidental. According to the official version, set forth on boundary stelae erected by Akhenaten, the place was indicated to him by Aten himself. It was located approximately halfway between Thebes, the old capital in the south, and Memphis, the ancient center in the north. Geographically, it was isolated by the desert, which was perhaps seen as an advantage. The new city was to be protected from the corrupting influence of old traditions. The construction of Akhetaten proceeded with incredible speed. Thousands of workers, artisans, and architects were brought from all over Egypt. Akhenaten personally supervised the work. His enthusiasm and will drove this grandiose project. The city was planned from scratch, which allowed for the implementation of new urban planning ideas. It stretched along the Nile for about 12 kilometers, its width being about 5 kilometers. The city's main axis, the Royal Road, ran parallel to the river, connecting the main palace and temple complexes. In the center of Akhetaten was the great temple of Aten, or Per Aten, meaning House of Aten. It was a huge structure consisting of a series of open courts with numerous altars. Unlike traditional Egyptian temples with their dark, mysterious sanctuaries, Aten's temple was flooded with sunlight. There was no statue of the god, as Aten himself, the solar disk, was visible to all. The main ritual was offering gifts to Aten: flowers, fruits, bread, incense, on numerous altars. The royal family, led by Akhenaten and Nefertiti, played a central role in these ceremonies, acting as the sole intermediaries between the god and the people. Next to the Great Temple was the Great Royal Palace, the pharaoh's official residence and a place for receptions and ceremonies. It included huge columned halls, courtyards, a throne room, and the famous Window of Appearances, from which Akhenaten and Nefertiti greeted the people and distributed rewards to their courtiers. North of the city center was the North Palace, which may have been Nefertiti's residence or used for special rituals. Its ruins have preserved fragments of amazing murals depicting birds and plants in the marshy thickets of the Nile, executed in the characteristic el-Amarna style. Akhetaten's residential quarters were also planned. The houses of nobles were spacious villas with gardens, pools, bathrooms, and Aten shrines. The houses of common townspeople were more modest, but were also built of mud brick and had several rooms. Archaeological excavations have shown that the city was divided into districts where artisans, officials, and soldiers lived. There was even a special village for workers who built tombs in the cliffs east of the city. Life in Akhetaten, at least in Akhenaten's vision, was to be filled with joy, light, and worship of Aten. The art of this period, the so-called Amarna art, reflected these ideals. It differed from the strict canon of preceding eras with greater realism, dynamism, and intimacy. The pharaoh and his family were depicted not in stiff, idealized poses, but in everyday scenes, playing with their daughters, embracing each other, mourning the dead. These depictions, on the one hand, emphasized the humanity of the royal couple, and on the other, their special connection with Aten, whose rays always extended to them, bestowing life and blessings. However, behind this facade of an ideal city, problems were hidden. The rapid construction required enormous resources, which placed a heavy burden on the country's economy. The transfer of the capital and administrative apparatus caused disorganization in state governance. Akhenaten's focus on religious reforms perhaps led to a weakening of attention to foreign affairs, which had negative consequences for Egyptian influence in Asia. Moreover, life in Akhetaten was probably not so idyllic for all its inhabitants. The new religion, imposed from above, could not completely supplant old beliefs. In the homes of common townspeople, archaeologists find amulets with images of traditional gods, such as Bes or Taweret, which indicates the persistence of popular cults. Furthermore, the city's isolation and its dependence on food supplies from other regions could lead to difficulties, especially in lean years. Akhetaten did not last long, only about 15 to 17 years. After Akhenaten's death and the collapse of his reforms, the city was abandoned, its temples and palaces destroyed, and its very location forgotten for millennia. But the dream of the city of the sun, of a utopia where people live in harmony with God and nature, lived on in legends and in the amazing artifacts that have come down to us from beneath the sands of Amarna. Akhetaten is a monument to the grand design and great tragedy of the reformer pharaoh who dared to challenge time and the gods. When Akhenaten proclaimed Aten the sole god and moved the capital to Akhetaten, he did not limit himself to theological and political transformations. His revolutionary spirit encompassed all spheres of life, and one of the most striking and impressive manifestations of the new era was art. Amarna art is a phenomenon unparalleled in the millennia-long history of ancient Egypt. It broke with age-old canons, offering a new perspective on the world, on man, and on the pharaoh himself. It was a true revolution in stone and paint, reflecting both the ideals of Atenism and perhaps the personal characteristics and preferences of Akhenaten himself. But what was this revolution, and what masterpieces did it bequeath to us? Traditional Egyptian art, formed over millennia, was subject to strict canons. Its main goal was not so much a realistic depiction of reality as the transmission of eternal, unchanging truths related to the divine order, known as Mayat, the pharaoh's power, and the afterlife. Depictions were static, idealized, figures were shown in profile, head and legs, and frontally, torso and eyes. The pharaoh always appeared young, strong, serene, an embodiment of divine power. Amarna art decisively departed from these canons. It is characterized by a striving for realism, sometimes even grotesque, for conveying individual features, emotions, and movement. One of the most striking innovations was the depiction of Akhenaten and his family. The pharaoh appears not as an idealized god ruler, but as a man with specific physical features: an elongated skull, which he may have inherited or which became a fashionable deformation, a thin neck, full lips, a sunken chest, a protruding belly, rounded hips, and thin legs. These features, which some researchers have tried to explain by various diseases, were more likely a conscious artistic device aimed at creating a new image of the pharaoh. Not a warrior, but a thinker, a prophet, a son of Aten. Nefertiti was also depicted in this new style, although her features were more harmonious and refined. The famous bust of Nefertiti from the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose in Akhetaten is a masterpiece of world art, astounding in its beauty, elegance, and regal dignity. It is executed with amazing realism, conveying not only external resemblance, but also the queen's inner strength. Scenes from the life of the royal family hold a special place in el-Amarna art. For the first time in Egyptian history, the pharaoh and queen are depicted in an intimate, family setting. They embrace and kiss each other, play with their daughters, mourn the dead. These depictions are full of tenderness, love, and human emotion, which was completely unthinkable for traditional Egyptian art. For example, one relief shows Akhenaten and Nefertiti seated on thrones with their three eldest daughters, Meritaten, Meketaten, and Ankhesenpaten, playing beside them. Aten extends its ray hands towards the royal couple, blessing them. These scenes were intended to emphasize the special connection between the pharaoh and his family with the god, and also to present them as a model of harmonious life under Aten's patronage. The new style manifested not only in sculpture and reliefs, but also in painting. Murals in Akhetaten's palaces and tombs are distinguished by bright colors, dynamic compositions, and attention to natural detail. The famous murals from the North Palace, depicting birds, fish, and plants in papyrus thickets, are striking in their liveliness and naturalism. el-Amarna artists sought to convey the beauty and diversity of the world created by Aten. However, this realism sometimes went to extremes, bordering on caricature or grotesque, especially in the early period of el-Amarna art. Some colossal statues of Akhenaten from Karnak depict him with exaggeratedly elongated and distorted features, which caused bewilderment and even rejection among contemporaries. Later, the style became softer and more harmonious, but retained its uniqueness. The question arises, what caused such a radical change in artistic canons? Undoubtedly, it was related to the new religion, Atenism, with its emphasis on light, life, nature, and the universality of divine creation, demanded new forms of expression. Akhenaten, as the high priest and prophet of Aten, wanted to see himself and his family depicted in accordance with the new worldview. Perhaps he personally gave instructions to artists and sculptors, encouraging their departure from old traditions. Moreover, el-Amarna art could also have been a political statement. By rejecting old artistic canons, Akhenaten also rejected the old ideology associated with the cult of Amun and other gods. The new style was meant to emphasize the uniqueness of his reign and his special connection with Aten. el-Amarna art was a short-lived but brilliant phenomenon. After Akhenaten's death and the restoration of old cults, it was consigned to oblivion and many of its masterpieces were destroyed. However, what has survived testifies to the incredible creative upsurge and courage of el-Amarna artists. They created art that was ahead of its time, art that still astounds today with its originality, expression, and humanity. It was art born of revolution, and it itself became a revolution in the world of ancient Egyptian art. At the center of the el-Amarna revolution, like two luminaries revolving around the all-consuming disk of Aten, stood Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Their images, permeated by the deity's rays, adorned the temples and palaces of Akhetaten. Their names were uttered in prayers. Their union seemed the embodiment of harmony and divine blessing. But who were they to each other? Was Nefertiti merely the beautiful companion of the reformer pharaoh, or did she play an independent, perhaps even equal role in the great transformations? Their story is one of love, faith, power, and, ultimately, an enigma that still fascinates researchers. Nefertiti, whose full name Nefer-Neferuaten means "beautiful are the perfections of Aten, the beautiful one has come," appears on the historical stage with Amenhotep IV's accession to the throne. Her origin, as mentioned, remains a subject of debate. Whether she was the daughter of the influential dignitary, Ai, who would later become pharaoh, or a foreign princess is not precisely known. However, her marriage to Akhenaten was not just a dynastic union. From the very beginning, she occupied an exceptionally high position, unprecedented for most Egyptian queens. Nefertiti was not merely the great royal wife, she was an active participant and promoter of the new cult of Aten. Her images frequently appear alongside Akhenaten's, and sometimes she is depicted as being of the same height as him, symbolizing their equal status. She participated in all religious ceremonies, made offerings to Aten, and drove the divine chariot. In some reliefs, she is even depicted in the traditional pharaonic pose of smiting enemies, which was absolutely unprecedented for a queen. Her titulary also emphasizes her special role: hereditary noblewoman, great of praise, lady of grace, sweet of love, mistress of the two lands, great king's wife, his beloved, lady of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nefer-Neferuaten Nefertiti, may she live forever and ever. She wore unique headdresses, such as the tall blue wig that became her trademark, or a flat-topped crown adorned with uri. Akhenaten and Nefertiti are often depicted with their 6 daughters: Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankhesenpaten, who later became Tutankhamun's wife, Nefer-Neferuaten Tasherit, Nefer-Neferure, and Setapenre. These family scenes, full of tenderness and love, were an important part of el-Amarna ideology. They were intended to present the royal family as a model of harmony and piety, blessed by Aten. Aten's rays always extend to Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters, bestowing upon them life, symbolized by the Ankh, and power, symbolized by the Waz scepter. There is much evidence of deep affection and love between Akhenaten and Nefertiti. In inscriptions, the pharaoh calls her the sweetness of his heart, she whose appearance rejoices Aten. Their joint depictions radiate warmth and mutual admiration. However, was this idyll truly cloudless? Around the 12th to 14th year of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti suddenly disappears from official records. Her name ceases to be mentioned, and her images are replaced by those of her eldest daughter, Meritaten, or the enigmatic figure Smenkhkare. What happened to the beautiful queen? This is one of the main mysteries of the Amarna period. Several hypotheses exist. According to one, Nefertiti died of illness or an accident. However, her tomb has never been definitively found, although some researchers suggest that one of the mummies discovered in the Valley of the Kings, the so-called Younger Lady from tomb KV35, might have belonged to her. According to another version, Nefertiti fell out of favor with Akhenaten and was removed from power. The reason could have been disagreements over religious policy. Perhaps Nefertiti was more moderate, or conversely, more radical than her husband, or personal conflicts. A third, most intriguing hypothesis suggests that Nefertiti did not disappear, but adopted a new name, Smenkhkare, and became Akhenaten's co-regent, and after his death, ruled independently as pharaoh for some time. Indirect evidence supports this version, such as the iconographic similarities between Nefertiti and Smenkhkare, as well as the discovery of cartouches with the name Nefer-Neferuaten, which Nefertiti bore, alongside Smenkkare's name. If this is true, Nefertiti would have been one of the few female pharaohs in Egyptian history, like Hatshepsut. Regardless of her subsequent fate, Nefertiti's role in the Amarna revolution was immense. She was not just a wife and mother, but an ideological companion, a high priestess, and possibly even Akhenaten's co-ruler. Their union, immortalized in Amarna art, remains one of the most vivid and enigmatic examples of a royal couple in world history. Together, they challenged thousand-year-old traditions. Together, they built a new world, and together, ultimately, they shared the tragic fate of their revolution. Their story is a hymn to love and faith, but also a warning about the fragility of human designs in the face of eternity. While Akhenaten and Nefertiti were absorbed in building their city of the sun and establishing the new faith, the world beyond Akhetaten did not stand still. The Egyptian empire, created by their mighty ancestors, stretched from Nubia to Syria, and its governance required constant attention, diplomatic skill, and military might. However, the reformer pharaoh seemed to increasingly withdraw from state affairs, preferring theological disputes and religious ceremonies to the harsh reality of international politics and internal problems. And gradually, shadows began to gather over the shining horizon of Aten, heralding the decline of utopia. One of the main internal problems generated by Akhenaten's reforms was the growing discontent among the population and the old elite. The closure of traditional gods' temples, the persecution of their priests, and the destruction of sacred images and texts. All this caused shock and outrage among many Egyptians. For the common people, whose lives were closely tied to age-old cults, the new abstract religion of Aten was alien and incomprehensible. They were deprived of their accustomed patron gods, intercessors in daily needs, and guides to the afterlife. Particularly painful was the rejection of the cult of Osiris, god of the dead, which questioned all established beliefs about posthumous existence. The priesthood of the old gods, especially the powerful priesthood of Amun, stripped of its wealth and influence, harbored resentment and awaited an opportune moment for revenge. Officials and military leaders, raised in ancestral traditions, may also have disapproved of the pharaoh's radical innovations. Although Akhenaten tried to create a new elite from his supporters, he could not completely ignore the old aristocracy. The economic consequences of the reforms were also significant. The grandiose construction in Akhetaten required enormous expenditure. Resources previously used to maintain temples throughout the country were now concentrated in the new capital. The confiscation of temple lands and wealth could have disrupted economic ties and reduced production. Moreover, the transfer of the capital and administrative apparatus caused disorganization in the country's governance. But perhaps the most serious problems arose in foreign policy. We can judge this from a unique source, the Amarna archive. This collection of clay tablets contains diplomatic correspondence between pharaohs, Amenhotep III, and Akhenaten, and rulers of Near Eastern states such as Babylonia, Assyria, Mitanni, the Hittite kingdom, Cyprus, and vassal princes of Syria and Palestine. The letters are written in Akkadian cuneiform. An analysis of the Amarna archive paints an alarming picture. Many vassal rulers complain about a lack of support from Egypt, aggression from neighbors, and invasions by nomadic Habiru tribes. They implore the pharaoh to send troops, gold, and chariots, but their requests often go unanswered or are met with great delay. For example, Rib-Hadda, ruler of Byblos, one of Egypt's most important outposts in Phoenicia, sends Akhenaten dozens of desperate letters describing the siege of his city and the betrayal of other vassals, but never receives real help. During this time, the Hittite kingdom in the north was strengthening and actively pushing back Egyptian influence in Syria. The Hittite king Suppiluliuma I conducted successful military campaigns, captured Egyptian possessions, and won over former allies of the pharaoh. The state of Mitanni, once a powerful ally of Egypt, weakened under Hittite and Assyrian attacks and gradually lost its importance. It appears that Akhenaten, preoccupied with his religious revolution, neglected foreign affairs. He possibly believed that Aten himself would protect Egypt and its domains. Or perhaps he simply lacked military talent and interest in warfare, unlike his Voinstvenich ancestors. His policy was rather passive, defensive, based on diplomacy and gift exchange, but not on decisive military actions. This led to a gradual erosion of Egyptian hegemony in the Near East. Vassals lost faith in the pharaoh's power, and enemies grew bolder. Although Egypt still remained a great power, its prestige and influence began to decline. Some researchers, however, dispute the traditional view of Akhenaten's exclusive pacifism and passivity. They point out that the el-Amarna archive also mentions Egyptian troops operating in Asia, and that Akhenaten did try to maintain diplomatic relations and control over his possessions. Perhaps the situation was not so straightforward, and the reformer pharaoh simply faced objective difficulties, such as the strengthening of the Hittite kingdom and internal instability in the Syro-Palestinian region. Nevertheless, the overall picture emerging from the sources suggests that Akhenaten's reign was a time of serious challenges, both domestically and internationally. The utopian city of the sun, built in the desert, proved not so impregnable to the shadows of the real world. Economic difficulties, social tension, religious schism, and weakening international influence. All this created fertile ground for a crisis that was inevitably bound to erupt after the reformer pharaoh's death. And this crisis threatened the very existence of his legacy. The last years of Akhenaten's reign are shrouded in even greater mystery than his rise to power. Sources become increasingly scarce and fragmentary. The shining horizon of Aten, it seemed, began to dim, and clouds gathered over the sun-worshipping pharaoh himself. What was happening in Akhetaten at this time? Was Akhenaten broken by the burden of problems, or did he remain a fanatical adherent of his faith until the end? And what was the cause of his death, which marked the end of one of the most unusual eras in Egyptian history? From about the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, tragic events began to occur in the royal family. His second daughter, Akhetaten, dies. Scenes of her mourning, depicted in the royal tomb at Akhetaten, are full of genuine grief. Akhenaten and Nefertiti bend over their daughter's body, their faces contorted with suffering. This is another testament to the humanity of the royal couple, but also a reminder of the transience of existence, even for those who considered themselves chosen by God. As mentioned, around this time, Nefertiti disappears from the scene. Her place beside Akhenaten is taken either by her eldest daughter, Meritaten, who became her father's great royal wife, not uncommon in ancient Egypt, or by the enigmatic figure Smenkhkare, who becomes Akhenaten's co-regent. The identity of Smenkhkare is one of the main mysteries of the el-Amarna period. Was he a man, perhaps Akhenaten's brother or son-in-law, or was it Nefertiti herself under a male name? If Smenkhkare was a separate individual, his reign was very short, and he died either shortly before Akhenaten or soon after. In the last years of Akhenaten's reign, internal resistance to his reforms possibly intensified. Economic difficulties, caused by the break with traditional economic centers and enormous expenditure on Akhetaten, may have worsened. Epidemics, which periodically devastated ancient Egypt, could also have played a role, undermining faith in Aten's benevolence. The el-Amarna archive attests to a deteriorating foreign policy situation, which could not but worry the military elite. There are suggestions that Akhenaten's own health might have deteriorated. His specific iconography, with elongated limbs and feminine features, has given rise to many hypotheses about possible diseases. Although most of these find no convincing confirmation, it cannot be excluded that the pharaoh did indeed suffer from some chronic ailment, which may have worsened towards the end of his life. Was Akhenaten alone in his final years? Did he lose the support of his closest associates? Did he fall victim to a conspiracy organized by Amun's priests or disgruntled nobles? There is no direct evidence for this, but such a possibility cannot be ruled out. In an atmosphere of religious fanaticism and political instability, conspiracies were not uncommon. Akhenaten died around the 17th year of his reign, approximately between 1336 and 1334 BCE. He was probably about 30 to 35 years old. The exact cause of his death is unknown. He was buried in his tomb, carved into the cliffs east of Akhetaten, known as Tomb Tiye 26. This tomb, though not fully completed, contains scenes of Aten worship, depictions of the royal family, and texts praising the new god. However, Akhenaten's body was possibly later moved elsewhere, as his mummy has not been confidently identified in this tomb. A male mummy discovered in tomb KV 55 in the Valley of the Kings, which some researchers identify as Akhenaten based on DNA analysis and archaeological data, is highly debated. This mummy was found in a damaged sarcophagus from which names had been erased, which may indicate posthumous persecution. Akhenaten's death was a turning point. His revolution, so bright and swift, proved too fragile to outlive its creator. He had no strong successor who could continue his work with the same conviction and fanaticism. The heir was young Tutankhaten, who would later become known as Tutankhamun, married to Akhenaten's daughter, Ankhesenpaten. Power effectively fell into the hands of influential dignitaries, such as A and Horemheb, who were closely connected with the old elite and the army. The decline of the sun-worshipping pharaoh was swift and tragic. His dream of a world illuminated by the rays of a single god shattered against harsh reality. But his figure, his ideas, his art left an indelible mark on history, continuing to evoke admiration, debate, and bewilderment. Akhenaten departed, but his shadow lingered long over Egypt, a reminder of a daring attempt to change the course of history. With Akhenaten's death, his grandiose religious experiment was doomed. Like a colossus on clay feet, the system that had rested on the will and charisma of one man began to crumble. Egypt, weary of radical changes and upheavals, longed for a return to familiar foundations, to its ancient gods and traditions, and the forces of restoration, long lurking in the shadows, emerged onto the stage to erase the very memory of the heretic Pharaoh and his city of the sun. The era of counter-reformation began, an era of Damnatio, Memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Akhenaten's immediate successor was the enigmatic Smenkhkare, whose reign was very short and left no significant mark. Perhaps he tried to find a compromise between Atenism and traditional cults, but his efforts were unsuccessful. After his swift death or disappearance, young Tutankhaten, who was only about 9 or 10 years old, ascended the throne. His name meant living image of Aten, indicating the continued, at least formal, influence of Atenism. His wife was Ankhesenpaten, the third daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. However, real power in the country belonged not to the boy pharaoh, but to his influential guardians and advisors, primarily Vizier I, who may have been Tutankhaten's maternal grandfather if Nefertiti was his daughter, and commander-in-chief of the army Horemheb. These men were representatives of the old elite, and they understood that to stabilize the country, it was necessary to return to traditional beliefs. As early as the 2nd or 3rd year of Tutankhaten's reign, a decisive turn occurred. The pharaoh changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. His wife also changed her name to Ankhesenamun. She lives for Amun. This was a symbolic act, signifying a complete rejection of Atenism and a return to the cult of Amun and other gods of the traditional pantheon. The capital was moved from Akhetaten back to Thebes, although Memphis also regained its importance as an administrative center. The process of restoration began. The temples of the old gods, closed and desecrated under Akhenaten, were reopened and restored. Amun's priesthood regained its privileges, lands, and wealth. The names of Amun and other gods, scraped from monuments, were restored. Tutankhamun's so-called Restoration Stela was issued, describing the deplorable state of Egypt under Akhenaten. The temples of gods and goddesses, it stated, had fallen into disrepair. Their shrines were abandoned and overgrown with grass. The country was in turmoil, and the gods had turned away from this land. The stela also proclaimed a program for restoring order and piety. Akhetaten, the city of the sun, was abandoned. Its inhabitants gradually returned to Thebes and other cities. Aten's palaces and temples were deserted and began to decay. Later, under the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, known as the Ramessides, Akhetaten was completely dismantled, its stone blocks used for new constructions elsewhere. The city's name was consigned to oblivion, but the restoration was not limited merely to reviving old cults. Systematic persecution of the memory of Akhenaten and his associates began. His name and images were scraped from monuments. His statues were smashed. His tomb in Akhetaten was desecrated. Akhenaten himself, in official documents, came to be referred to as the enemy from Akhetaten, or that criminal. This was a classic Damnatio Memoriae, a condemnation of memory intended to completely erase a person from history, as if he had never existed. The same fate befell Nefertiti, Smenkhkare, and other prominent figures of the el-Amarna period. Their names were struck from royal lists. Their reign came to be seen as a time of chaos and godlessness. After Tutankhamun's short reign, he died at about 19 under mysterious circumstances. I ascended the throne, ruling for only about 4 years. Then power passed to Horemheb, a former military commander who became the founder of the new 19th dynasty, although he is formally considered the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Horemheb continued the policy of eradicating Atenism and restoring traditional order with even greater determination. It was under him that the most extensive actions to destroy Amarna's heritage were undertaken. It seemed that Akhenaten and his revolution had vanished forever into oblivion. His name was forgotten, his city destroyed, his god rejected. Egypt returned to its old ways, and the glory of Amun-Ra once again shone over the two lands. For nearly 3,000 years, Akhenaten remained but a faint shadow, a ghost mentioned in curses. But history, as is known, has a way of returning, and the heretic pharaoh was destined for a second birth in modern times, when the inquisitive minds of researchers and accidental archaeological finds brought him forth from the darkness of oblivion into the light of history. Centuries gave way to centuries. Millennia blended into eternity. Egypt saw the arrival of Greeks and Romans, Arabs and Turks. The names of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Aten were securely buried beneath the sands of time and oblivion. Only in rare, heavily damaged inscriptions, incomprehensible to the uninitiated, might distorted echoes of their names have flickered. But in the 19th century CE, when Europe was swept by a wave of interest in ancient civilizations, and Egypt became a mecca for archaeologists, travelers, and adventurers, the slow and difficult return of the heretic pharaoh from non-existence began. This was a true second birth, almost as dramatic as his first earthly life. One of the first to notice the strange reliefs and inscriptions, differing from traditional Egyptian style, was John Gardner Wilkinson, an English Egyptologist who worked in Egypt in the first half of the 19th century. He discovered ruins of an ancient city and tombs with unusual depictions of a pharaoh with an elongated face and his family worshipping a solar disk in the area of modern-day Tel el-Amarna. However, it was not yet clear then who this pharaoh was or his place in history. The breakthrough occurred in the second half of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1887, a local peasant woman accidentally found a large archive of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform in Tel el-Amarna. This was the famous Amarna archive, the diplomatic correspondence of Akhenaten and his father Amenhotep III. The decipherment of these tablets not only shed light on Egypt's international relations in the 14th century BCE, but also allowed for a more precise dating of the reformer pharaoh's reign and an understanding of the context of his era. Systematic archaeological excavations in Tel el-Amarna followed, conducted by various expeditions, including a German one led by Ludwig Borchardt and an English one led by Flinders Petrie and Howard Carter. These excavations revealed to the world the ruins of Akhetaten, its temples, palaces, residential quarters, and artisan workshops. Thousands of artifacts were found: sculptures, reliefs, stelae, pottery, household items, and jewelry. One of the most sensational finds was the aforementioned bust of Nefertiti, discovered by Borchart's expedition in 1912 in the ruins of the sculptor Thutmose's workshop. This bust, striking in its beauty and preservation, immediately became an icon of Amarna art and one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt. Parallel to the excavations in Amarna, research was conducted in other places associated with Akhenaten. In Karnak, remnants of Aten's temple, known as Gempatan, and colossal statues of Akhenaten in the early Amarna style were discovered. In the Valley of the Kings, tombs were found that might be related to Akhenaten and his family, such as Tomb KV 55, where a disputed mummy, possibly belonging to Akhenaten, was found, and Tomb KV 35, where the mummy of the younger lady, whom some identify as Nefertiti, or Tutankhamun's mother, was discovered. As archaeological data accumulated and texts were deciphered, the figure of Akhenaten began to emerge before scholars, not just as one of many pharaohs, but as a unique religious reformer, thinker, poet, creator of a new faith and new art. His story, full of drama, mystery, and contradictions, captured the imagination not only of scholars, but also of the general public. Akhenaten became the subject of numerous studies, monographs, articles, as well as works of fiction, novels, plays, operas, films. His image was interpreted in various ways. Some saw him as the first monotheist, a forerunner of Moses and Christ, a genius ahead of his time. Others as a fanatic, a despot, a destroyer of traditions, whose reforms led Egypt to crisis. Sigmund Freud, in his work, Moses and Monotheism, hypothesized that Moses was an Egyptian, a follower of Akhenaten, and that Akhenaten's teaching about Aten formed the basis of Jewish monotheism. This hypothesis, though not directly confirmed by sources, greatly influenced the perception of Akhenaten in 20th century culture. Debates surrounding Akhenaten continue to this day. Was his religion true monotheism? What were his real motives? Religious convictions, political calculation, or personal ambition? What was Nefertiti's fate? Who was Smenkhkare? What caused the collapse of Atenism? Many of these questions still lack definitive answers. But one thing is certain: Akhenaten's second birth in modern times returned to humanity one of the most vivid and intriguing pages of its history. The pharaoh whom they tried to erase from memory once again took his place in the pantheon of great figures of the past. His story is not only an account of ancient Egypt, but also an eternal reminder of the power of the human spirit, the pursuit of truth, the price of change, and the fact that even the boldest dreams can be buried under the sands of time, only to be reborn one day and shine with new strength. The echo of Amarna continues to resonate through the millennia, compelling us to reflect on the eternal questions of existence. And so, our long journey through the paths of the Amarna era draws to a close. We have traveled from the golden age of Amenhotep III to the ruins of Akhetaten, from the birth of a prince destined to become a reformer to his mysterious death and subsequent condemnation of memory. We have tried to penetrate the essence of his revolutionary faith, admired the beauty of Amarna art, followed the drama of his family life and the political vicissitudes of his reign. But who was Akhenaten really? A prophet who envisioned a single god long before others? A heretic who destroyed the sacred foundations of his people? Or an eternal seeker of truth ahead of his time and misunderstood by his contemporaries? There is no definitive answer to this question, and perhaps there never will be. The figure of Akhenaten remains one of the most controversial and multifaceted in world history, and his legacy continues to provoke debate and inspire reflection. To some, Akhenaten is a symbol of religious genius, the first harbinger of monotheism in human history. His great hymn to the Aten, with its sublime imagery and profound philosophical content, is compared to the Psalms of David and other masterpieces of religious poetry. His aspiration to purify religion from polytheism, magic, and anthropomorphic representations of divinity is seen as an anticipation of ideas that would later form the basis of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. From this perspective, Akhenaten was a beacon who lit the spark of true faith in the darkness of paganism, a prophet whose message was too radical for his time, but found resonance in subsequent eras. For others, Akhenaten is, above all, a politician who used religion as an instrument to strengthen his absolute power. His struggle with Amun's priesthood is seen as an attempt to crush a powerful rival and centralize all resources and levers of governance in his own hands. The elevation of Aten and the proclamation of himself as its sole son and intermediary gave him unlimited authority and control over the minds and hearts of his subjects. From this viewpoint, his reforms were not so much a spiritual breakthrough as a pragmatic political move, albeit cloaked in religious form. Still others see Akhenaten as a fanatic, obsessed with his idea to such an extent that he was willing to destroy the age-old traditions of his people, neglect state interests, and condemn his country to turmoil and decline. His intolerance of other gods, his iconoclasm, his isolation in Akhetaten, all this, in their opinion, testifies to the despotic nature of his rule and his detachment from reality. The collapse of Atenism after his death is seen as the logical outcome of an adventure lacking a solid foundation. There is also a romantic image of Akhenaten, a poet, a dreamer, an idealist who sought to build a kingdom of light, love, and harmony on earth. His relationship with Nefertiti, their family life immortalized in el-Amarna art, appears as a hymn to love and fidelity. His city of the sun, as a utopian dream of a perfect society living in unity with nature and God. From this perspective, Akhenaten was a tragic figure, a misunderstood genius whose ideals were too lofty for a coarse world. Perhaps the truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between, and Akhenaten's personality combined all these traits. He could have been a sincerely believing mystic, and at the same time, a cunning politician. He could have been a loving husband and father, and simultaneously, a ruthless tyrant towards his opponents. He could have been a brilliant visionary, and at the same time, a naive dreamer. Regardless of how we assess his personality and motives, Akhenaten's legacy is undeniable. He left us unique art, astounding in its beauty and originality. He created a religious philosophical system that still evokes admiration and debate. He challenged established notions of God, power, and man, forcing reflection on fundamental questions of existence. The Amarna period, though short, influenced the further development of Egyptian civilization. Although the old cults were restored after Akhenaten's death, some elements of Amarna art and theology may have been assimilated and transformed in subsequent eras. Debates about the possible influence of Atenism on the emergence of Jewish monotheism continue, and although there is no direct proof, the very posing of this question testifies to the significance of Akhenaten's ideas. Today, Akhenaten is not just a historical figure. He is a symbol of searching, a symbol of rebellion against routine and dogmatism, a symbol of striving for the new. His story reminds us that progress is often associated with breaking from the past, overcoming resistance, and a willingness to go against the current. But it also reminds us that radical changes, imposed from above without regard for traditions and popular sentiment, can lead to tragic consequences. The mysteries of Amarna are not yet fully unraveled. The sands of Egypt continue to guard their secrets, and perhaps future discoveries will shed new light on the life and reign of the sun-worshipping Pharaoh. But even what we know today is enough to consider Akhenaten one of the most vivid and significant figures in human history. He was like a meteor that blazed a fiery trail across the sky of ancient Egypt, a trail that is still visible today, compelling us to peer into the past and reflect on the eternal. His city of the sun long ago turned to ruins, His name was cursed, his God forgotten. But the dream of light, of unity, of harmony, this dream is immortal. And as long as humanity strives for knowledge, for truth, for perfection, the shadow of Akhenaten, the seeker pharaoh, will be invisibly present beside us, reminding us of the great drama that unfolded on the banks of the Nile more than 3,000 years ago. A drama that continues to stir our minds and hearts, said they. Thank you for your attention, for accompanying us on this long journey, delving into the mysteries of ancient Egypt and the destiny of one of its most amazing rulers. I hope this account was not only informative for you, but also engaging. Subscribe to our channel, leave your comments, share your thoughts. Many more interesting stories and mysteries of the past await us. Until next time,